This time on Engine Masters, we are going to show you the power and tuning secrets of carburetor spacers. We got the open spacer, we got the 4-hole, we got 2 intake manifolds, we got a 3-3 small block. It's everything you need to know. I blame you for this. You know why? Because viewers have asked us for like 2 years to do an episode all about carburetor spacers. You would ask, why have we resisted? Well, the thing is, these carb spacers, they really change their effect on performance depending on the intake manifold design, the engine displacement and camshaft, the carburetor that's used. There's a lot of different effects that they can have on performance. We think we've put together a combination here that is sort of as broad and representative as possible for you. But first, let's talk about what a carburetor spacer is. There it is. It's as simple as that. It's one of the cheapest things that you can do to change the performance of your engine. You simply put it on your intake manifold right there, slap your carburetor on top of it. And it affects the distribution of the manifold, the fuel curve, all sorts of things that you will see. The thing is, there's a lot of different types of carburetor spacers. This one is what we call an open. This is what we call a 4-hole. These are both 1 inch tall. You can get them like up to 2 or 3 inches tall. There's other variations that are like a tapered combo, or ones with steps, or ones that are just split in the middle. But let's be honest, these are the 2 that really matter in the world. The other thing that's different about these is that they come in all kinds of materials. You can get them in wood, you can get them in plastic with little rubber inserts that keep the carburetor from vibrating. You can get them in die-cast aluminum, billet aluminum, or what this is, which is phenolic resin. What is phenolic resin? I questioned it because thermoquads have the main body made out of phenolic resin, but what does that even mean? It's based on an organic compound called phenol, and it's mixed with formaldehyde and some acid and stuff like that, and it becomes hard plastic. You know what's made out of phenolic resin? Carburetor spacers and pool balls. All right, there's completely random information for you. Let me tell you what we're gonna do for the test today. So the victim we've got here today is our 383 small block Chevy that you have seen in a zillion episodes of Engine Masters, but we've changed it up a little bit for reliability. So this is the same blueprint engines short block that you've seen over and over, but we kept on seeing a valve float problem at the top end, and Steve Brule really wanted to fix that because he was worried in some tests that it might affect the results, and so he wanted valve train stability. He started by putting solid roller lifters on our hydraulic roller lifter camshaft. It's the same cam we've always had. The degrees of duration at 50 are 230 on the intake, 236 on the exhaust, and for performance, we also changed the cylinder heads. This is an aluminum Dart Pro 1. It's got a 215cc cast intake port. Now we're also gonna change the intake manifolds on this thing, including a baseline with our Dart single plane. Now here's the mind-blowing thing. All of those changes, and believe it or not, it makes exactly the same power curve that it made before all of those changes, but it is way more stable up top. Now in our testing, you're gonna see we're gonna switch from this Dart single plane to the Dart dual plane intake manifold, and that's because we know from experience that the 4-hole and the open spacer perform radically differently depending on what intake manifold you put on them. And so we're gonna kick it off with the single plane, then move to the dual plane, and you will find out the magic of the carburetor spacer. How simple is that?
So for this test, what we've decided to do is add a couple of sensors that we don't always use. And one is the air hat, which measures airflow that the engine is drawing in cubic feet per minute. And the other one is these 802 sensors. They're oxygen sensors, not dissimilar to what you have in your regular passenger car, but we have one in every cylinder so we can identify the air-fuel ratio in every cylinder. We're potentially only looking at 2 or 3 horsepower differences in some of these spacers. And so we want to be able to identify where the gain or loss is occurring. And so, like they say, you can never have too much data. So we're gonna go in, baseline this thing, get some numbers, and move on from there. Spacers are tough to predict. The only one I think I can predict, I'll probably be wrong, is the open on a dual plane.
Dispense with the chit-chat, gentlemen. Baseline it, Brule. I'm
Yes,
cutting to
sir.
the chase.
Wow, wow. Taking charge, Freiberger.
With authority.
What's gotten into you?
All right. Performed as expected.
Yes.
Well, there's our baseline with no carburetor spacer whatsoever. Basically the same exact power as we've seen with this engine a zillion times that we've tested it. 466.5 pound-feet of torque at 4,300 RPM and up at 60, oh no, this time it's 6,000 RPM peak, 469.4 horsepower. And where do you want to start? 4-hole spacer or open spacer?
Let's do the 4-hole first.
I concur. I was thinking 4-hole first and then the open spacer for the big number.
Is that because we all think that the open spacer has some potential for a little more power? So
Not necessarily. The thing about spacers is they can be really unpredictable. So
Wait a minute. Off camera, you predicted 7 horsepower with the open.
Yeah.
On this manifold.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going 0. But you never know until you try.
I'm going with you this time.
Okay, 4-holer. See, he said this time, like I'm normally wrong.
No.
Man, Brulé is just on a roll. Oh, fail! The studs are too short.
Take it off.
How do they do that? Those must be for a 3/4 inch spacer. All right, Brulé, take it off.
All right, we've got the 4-hole spacer installed. We're getting the air hat on so we can check to see if there's any measurable change in airflow, which may attribute to a power change or not. We don't know yet, but it's another piece of data to grab. Dulcich and I have got the 4-hole spacer installed, so we're going to go check it out.
While you guys were buttoning up the air hat, I was toasting myself a delectable Pop-Tart.
You're not even allowed to eat those,
Yeah,
Freiberger.
it was against the advice of my nutritionist, I have to say.
Priorities.
Oh, well.
So
I'll let
what's
you
going
have
to
that.
happen with the 4-hole, Dulcich?
I think it'll make 2 more foot-pounds of torque, and that's it.
I've learned not to
He's-
question him.
He's always good for
Well,
a
no,
laugh.
I mean, and that's going to be below peak torque.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I say run it.
Make more power.
I didn't see much of a change in air-fuel ratio,
No.
which is interesting.
Before we look at power, we're looking at air-fuel ratio. We've seen that spacers can affect the signal at the carburetor, which will change the air-fuel ratio. And what are you seeing here?
Pretty close
Richer
down there.
low and leaner at the top, which the leaner at the top is puzzling to me.
As a general rule, would you say the 4-hole tends to draw on the carburetor more than the open?
Yes.
Here's what we're looking at for our first pull with the 4-hole spacer, 467.3 pound-feet of torque, 474.6 horsepower, which appears to be a little bit up from no spacer at all. Is that because it's lean or is that because of the spacer?
It's made a couple of foot-pounds more at the bottom and more horsepower at the top. Who'd have thunk it?
Could this be because it's lean up there?
There's another thing you need to look at, and that's going to be pounds per hour of fuel, because it may have different distribution, which will show sometimes an air-fuel ratio, and it's actually using almost the same amount of fuel.
Okay.
It's pulling more fuel, and it's showing a leaner mixture,
Right. So
and
let's
it's making more power.
So let's look at the
distribution.
cylinder distribution, yeah. That was very astute, Dulcich.
Well, you know, I'm a student of the engine science.
I really liked it. It's still 14.6 to 11.5.
Well, let's compare it to another.
Yeah, let's see if it's tighter without the spacer. There you go. So red is no spacer, black is
tighter
with
at
the
the top.
4-hole. It's a,
See that?
yeah, here,
Where it's making more power. it
almost
is
tighter.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it affected the manifold distribution tiny bit.
And it actually helped on the bottom because you don't have those two that are way out of the field there at the low end that are 15s.
These two?
Yeah. So it did help.
I'm going to say it's more cylinder to cylinder than
than
any other
Yeah.
single thing.
So no spacer moved more air, but with the spacer, made a little bit more power.
Very
So
small bit, like 4 CFM or something.
manifold distribution.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
looks a little tighter, so that's more than any one single thing. I think that's probably.
I think we're out of tune-up options. We go straight to the open spacer. So it's easy as that, which is why you can test this stuff at home or on the drag strip just by stocking up on spacers and flopping them underneath the carburetor. I finished my Pop-Tart, so I'm ready to run the open spacer.
All
What do you
right.
think the open spacer does?
We might see that it needs more jet, maybe. I don't think it's gonna make more power because I think this manifold's already too big for the engine. All right, fire it up, let's go. And the open spacer makes 469.9 pound-feet of torque and 472 horsepower, which is up just a hair, I believe, but we need to look at the overlay to compare. Let's compare it first to no spacer whatsoever. So this is a look at the red line, which is no spacer at all, and the black line, which is the open spacer. So you can see that the open spacer lost a tiny bit of power in the neighborhood of 4,000 RPM, and it made power from 4,500 all the way up, but then difference gets pretty negligible.
Yeah, curiously, it really moved up the peak torque
Yeah, I was
RPM.
looking at that too. 4,700s from 4,300.
Yeah, there's like a blip right there where it came up. But now we have to compare the open spacer that we just tested to the 4-hole. So the 4-hole is in red and the open spacer is in black. Basically what we saw in our comparison between the two spacers, the open and the 4-hole, is that they traded places in power throughout the curve, but none of it was significant enough. What we're looking at now is air-fuel ratio distribution. In black is the open spacer and in red is the 4-hole, and you can see that the red 4-hole is actually better.
It's grouped them tighter.
Yeah, which makes sense actually because it's doing something about the velocity through the carburetor, whereas the open spacer's just adding plenum volume. Now, trend-wise, the 4-hole on the single-plane manifold tends to improve like low-end drivability, signal to the carburetor, and in this case, distribution. And I think we're gonna see the opposite when we go to the dual plane, which is that it's gonna prefer the open instead of the 4-hole.
Yeah.
But we're gonna go find that out right now as we go install the dual plane and do it all over again. With the carburetor off this, you can see that this Dart intake is a single plane, wide open plenum. This would be typically designed for something that makes more RPM, more power, more displacement than this engine. The reason we're running two different manifolds is because spacers can have a different effect depending on whether it is a single plane or a dual plane. So this is the dual plane that we will be installing. This is an air gap style dual plane. It is much more suited to the type of engine this is. We're gonna anticipate seeing this thing make a whole lot more torque than that. And we will show you the power difference between these two intakes before we start messing around with spacers. We've already done our first pull with a dual plane. It was really rich. We went out there and leaned it out by 9 jet sizes overall, which is a big whack. And we're gonna see if it makes a difference in power. Doesn't care.
Kind of poochy, I think, at the top.
Yeah, I would say so. So after the tune-up on the dual plane, where we went in and leaned it out some, it actually just came down a hair in power. We're looking at 474 pound-feet of torque and 454.6 horsepower. Look at that. The red lines here show the single-plane intake manifold with the 4-hole spacer on it, and the black is this dual plane with no spacer. As you can see, the red lines are just grouped much more tightly, and the dual plane is much bigger, and so it's not a matter of runner length making the power difference. We think it's probably that there's some cylinders that just aren't in the mood to make power because we're barely feeding them any fuel, or we're feeding them too much.
Yeah, I mean, it tilted the curve, so I mean, the runner length is taking care of it down there, but I think we've just got issues up there with fueling the cylinders. Cylinders at 16-to-1 don't make power.
Right.
Yep, and there's nothing you can do about that in the carburetor to fix it.
Maybe the
But
spacers may help.
the 4-hole spacer.
It may.
It may.
That may help.
We don't know. Is that our next step?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to go out there and put the 4-hole spacer atop the dual plane intake manifold. Okay, 465.8 pound-feet of torque, 455.5 horsepower. We're pretty much saying that's a 0. But to really know, we have to compare it to the curve of the regular dual plane with no spacer. Okay, red lines are the no spacer, black lines is the 4-hole. It's smoothed out the curve. The range here is not that different. We're talking about 12.4 to 12.8, negligible, but this is flatter.
Okay, I could say we can count out air fuel. Let's look at the individual cylinder distribution.
I'm going to read you off the cylinders in order, 1, 2, 3, all the way to 8. 15.9 to 1, 12.9, 14.4, 13.8, 14.1, 12.5, 14.9, and 12.0. What's the trend that you're seeing there?
Yeah, well, we're seeing it's all on one side. We're seeing a whole bunch of lean cylinders. These cylinders are not making power, and that's why it got worse when we leaned the carburetor out, is they made even less power.
Right.
Well, the trend that I'm seeing is that it's every odd cylinder that's lean.
Yeah, it's one side of the engine.
bank,
Yep.
which makes no sense because on the dual plane manifold, one level is feeding inner to and outer on the other side.
I know.
And the other level is doing the opposite. So
It can't do this, but it is.
Okay, so final answer on this thing is we suspect this manifold is not that good because of the leanness along one bank, but what we know is that the 4-hole spacer did nothing good on this combination.
No matter how much we tried and fought
Maybe
with it.
the open spacer is going to be the miracle worker here.
Let's hope. It's what we normally see, but who knows?
There's only one way to find out.
We're gonna change to the open spacer. Final step. This is the dual plane manifold with the open spacer, and preemptively, Brule has already thrown 6 more jet sizes in the back and 3 in the front. Open spacers tend to make less signal on the carburetor, meaning that you have to put larger jets to achieve the same air-fuel ratio, and that's what Steve did before we even started. So the horsepower that we saw just now was 465.8 and the torque 478.2 with the open spacer. Let's look at it versus no spacer at all. So black is the open spacer and red is no spacer at all. So that is absolutely the right thing to do.
That's a lot of horsepower.
Yeah, I didn't expect that it was that big of a hit, but man.
I didn't either.
And that comes down to the cylinder distribution. It's not just that the spacer made that, it's that more cylinders are doing,
Their work.
They've come to the party. Reason why I think the cylinders are more evenly distributed is that 1-inch spacer is sharing more pulses side to side
You've got better
from the two
communication.
planes.
Yeah.
Better communication, exactly. And so the fuel's making a turn somehow and getting to wherever it needs to be in a better way.
But wait,
I
I wonder if it's using more air too, or if it's taking in more air with the single spacer, because that's a big chunk of horsepower. You would think there would be more air, or is it all efficiency and better distribution?
If cylinders are making more power, they're not necessarily drawing more
Not
air.
necessarily.
We're
but
going to look.
Let's find out.
This is what we've...
Whoa!
No.
So it's all efficiency,
all
basically.
efficiency.
And that's what I mean. If they're making more power, if it's because they're richer instead of leaner, it's not going to draw more air. It's that it's using the fuel more efficiently.
Yeah.
So I think the last thing that we need to do is look at our best run with the single plane, which was with the 4-hole spacer, and our best run with the dual plane, which was with the open spacer. So black is the open spacer on the dual plane. Red is the 4-hole on the single plane. It's tipped right in the middle, pretty much like you would expect for dual plane versus single plane.
So now it's a question of what are you doing with the car?
Right, this is your drive around thing with the dual plane on it, and if you're drag racing this junk, then you want to go with the single plane and the 4-hole.
We're looking at this thing, and I'm going like, wow, that is really a decent combination now. We took kind of a... and polished
Mediocre.
it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
We did.
and those are pretty good changes considering the cost of a spacer is pretty minor when you consider cost of speed parts.
Yeah, it's like 15 bucks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And that's the difference. All right,
Okay,
I'm good.
me too.
Cool.
That was fun.
Out of here.
Yeah. Okay, Steve, I think we've seen why I generally didn't want to do this episode, because all the performance is so dependent on the engine and the intake manifold, but I think I do have some general conclusions.
Well, yeah, I think we basically broke it down to the most likely scenario. So take it away, Freiberger.
The most likely scenario, I would say, is that a 1-inch open spacer almost always improves a dual plane intake manifold. Not always, but generally.
Agreed.
Okay?
Yeah.
And I would also say that a 4-hole spacer on the single plane intake manifold more rarely can help as far as distribution and performance.
Yeah.
And I'd say that's especially true if you've got a big single plane on an engine that doesn't really deserve it.
Case in point.
So are we on the same page so
Yeah.
far? I mean, not just from this test, but from the general things that we've all seen in the past. I think those are the trends that are kind of true.
You'll likely see those results, but don't count on it.
Right. And I think also we didn't bother testing some stuff that we knew wasn't gonna work. There's 2-inch spacers as well in multiple designs. In fact, I think you can buy 3-inchers, can't you?
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah, you hope so, because it looks cool. And that's an open. But then there's Dulcich's favorite and the most fun-named spacer on Earth, the Super Sucker. This is actually more generically known as a tapered combo. See how it's 4-hole on the top and it tapers into an open at the bottom? That's supposed to be super trick, but honestly, we've messed around with stuff like this, and when you go to a 2-incher on an engine this mild, you don't really get any benefit out of it, which brings me back to, you gotta try it every single time, and you gotta jet it every single time.
Yeah, and I kind of took something away that I wasn't expecting. To me, I always thought the volume was the big player, but what I found out is it basically is how the carburetor is interacting with the manifold when you stick that spacer in between, and that changes. We saw that in the fuel distribution.
On both tests?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why you were talking off camera about how guys will go to the drag strip and try a bunch of spacers and never touch the carburetor, and it just doesn't work that way. Honest truth, if you want to get the most out of your carburetor spacer, you need an oxygen sensor in every single hole so you can see what's going on. At minimum, you need 2 oxygen sensors in your headers. Do you agree?
Yeah, or a lot of drag testing will
Yeah.
do the same thing.
Exactly. But generally, I would say your ultimate takeaway is if you've got a dual plane, try a 1-inch open spacer, and that's the end of the story. It's about the cheapest power you can get. As a matter of fact, Dulcich wants to go home and make one out of plywood.
Oh yeah, I can do that.
And so we hope to have more in-depth and factual information in future episodes of Engine Masters.
The thing I'm wondering is whether the open spacer is going to be as good as the 4-hole. That's why we dyno test, Freiberger. You know, because the racetrack, the pits, the internet, they're all full of experts. You know, they know what's going to happen. They'll tell you what a 4-hole will do, what an open spacer will do. But you know what? I don't want to listen to those guys. I would listen to the dyno. That's the way I do it. Engine Masters.